Welcome to Dear Book Coach. I'm Terry Thayer, author, certified book coach, certified focusing professional.
And I am Carrie Savage, writer, book coach, and project manager.
And I'm Stephanie Detlefs, writer and certified book coach.
This is a friendly advice space for you as you plan, draft, and revise your novel. In each video, we answer questions submitted by a writer like you from 3 different points of view. And you get to pick the advice that works the best for you. Today's question comes in from Lola. How important is setting or place? Carrie?
Well, that's a great question. Setting and place is really important. It's important for a number of reasons, and it's important for all different kinds of books, I think in all different genres. Certainly sometimes it can be one of the most important. You've heard people talk about how setting or place can almost be like another character in the novel. I always think about, when I think about setting, about Louise Penny's Inspector Gamache series, because if they weren't set in Three Pines or a place like Three Pines, would they be as good? I don't know. I love them, but part of what I love about them is just the charm and the characters and the setting of Three Pines. So that is, I think, a place where, setting does a lot of work towards establishing other things about the novel and the whole series. It also, setting in place gives very important context. I think a novel, obviously set in rural Vermont in the summertime, is going to have a very different feel to one that's set in Chicago in the deep winter. Those experiences, the characters, what they're going to be interacting with and reacting to, just in terms of the weather and their surroundings and how people are moving throughout their spaces, are all going to feel very different depending on that kind of thing. And the more unfamiliar a reader is with the place or setting of your novel, the more important it is, the more work that you have to do as a writer in terms of world building. Because I think, a lot of us can understand a contemporary novel set in, present day or sometime around that. We have a lot of shared context that we can bring to bear on that, which doesn't mean, again, that setting isn't important, but there are certain assumptions that I think we would come to. As opposed to like a fantasy that's set in a mythical world, or a historical that's set in the Middle East in the 15th century, is likely going to be very unfamiliar to your reader, unless someone who happens to love Middle Eastern 15th century history picks up your novel and hopefully, finds a lot of things that they already know about and they feel very smart. But that is why there's so many world building classes and so many world building worksheets and other tools that you can use to make sure that you thought about and are making use of all of these critical aspects of setting, to assist and make sure that your readers can understand and enjoy not only the world that you've built itself, but how your characters, again, are interacting with it, are moving through it, what those structures and settings mean to them in terms of the overall context of the novel. So in short, it's very important. Stephanie, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a message you're going to hear from all of us, is that it does matter. It's important. I was thinking as Carrie was talking that I was going to say this too, there are some books where knowing the setting and spending the time and spending the real estate on the page to describe that setting, to give the reader a sense of the place, is going to be more important than in other books. And I hadn't really considered this, but the book that I'm working on, which is a middle grade novel, it's contemporary, it's mostly set in a middle school. It's set in the city where I live for my own convenience, but it could really easily be set in another middle school somewhere else. It would need to be set in America probably, but not even necessarily. So it isn't as important in mine, the specific city, the specific town, the specific environment isn't quite as important. However, and on the flip side of that, I should say, there are books where the place almost becomes its own character in a way. Like it plays so much into the mood and the tone, and the reason why the characters are doing things is because of where they are. And so that's just something to consider as well. So you'll have to think about that with your own work in progress. Whether it's a real place or whether it's a fictional world that you're creating, no matter where your story is set, and no matter how intertwined the location and other setting issues are intertwined in your story, you have to set some sort of stage for your characters to be in or on, because otherwise your characters are just floating around like bubbles bumping into each other, and they're not grounded in a place, right? So when you're writing, you are picturing them having a conversation, and whether you're noticing it or not, they're not in a blank void. They're standing in a room that has stuff in it. They're in a town that has stuff in it and other people in it. And those people are passing by, and they're interacting with that space in your mind. What you have to do is give your reader enough of that so that we can start to visualize it in our own mind. Now, what I visualize as the reader might not be the same as what you visualized as the writer. In fact, it probably won't be, and that's fine. But what you don't want is just your characters in this blank void, I can't think of another word for it, where they're having conversations and making decisions with nothing happening around them. So you're not going to put in every detail. We've talked about this maybe in our Show Don't Tell video that we've done, maybe in a couple of other ones where we've talked about descriptive language. I feel like I'm stumbling over my words a little bit today, but you're not going to put every single detail in there, but you do need to have key details, and then allow some space for the reader's imagination to fill in. You do have to give us something, and make sure that those things that you choose are intentional. You're not just choosing them for no reason. If you're describing a vase on the table, that vase needs to be there for some sort of reason, even if it's really small. So I think that's all I wanted to say. And I hope that was helpful. Terry, I was just talking in circles just there.
I'm just wondering why that vase is on your shelf over there now, because
oh, this one, yeah, with my little fake plant, because I can't keep real ones alive.
See, it tells us about her character. She can't keep plants. Neither can I, but yeah. It's making me think how setting, characters are defined by where they live. Somebody in Stephen King's book, Living in the Maine Woods, is a very different person than Craig Johnson's Longmire, living in Wyoming in wide open spaces. And so people are defined by where they live. If they choose to live there, that could say one thing. If they don't, but they're still defined by the mountains around them or whatever it is. So setting can really help you to build your character's arc as well. So as a reader, I often pick up new authors based on where they're set. If it's a setting I would like to read about. I read a lot of mysteries. Dana Stabenow's mysteries set in Alaska are just amazing. And I never would have learned about substance. I'm sorry, we are stumbling over our words. Subsistence living that they do through the winter time. And so the settings, those books in particular, are really important. And again, it tells us about the character, the grit that it takes to live in a place like that. And then for like a mystery, that's a great character for a amateur sleuth to have. I recently read a wonderful book called Intimacies that's set in the International Court in The Hague. And the setting was a big part of that book. The book itself, the story itself, is kind of a small story. It's kind of a love story, but she talks so much about this protagonist who has moved here for this job and doesn't know anything about The Hague. She talks about the way the people are there, the way the court works, where the translators sit, because she's a translator in respect to the prisoners. She goes to the prison. So all of these things just really filled out this book in a really meaningful way as the character herself is learning her way around. if you do use a real place, please be careful to get it right. I once was reading a series by a very famous author, and his protagonists were racing up and down San Francisco and on what I knew were one-way streets, and I just felt like they were going the wrong way. And I put the book down because I was kind of like, how can I trust this guy? He doesn't even look on a map. I mean, and now with Google Earth, it's so easy to do these things. But I also remember being at a book conference and hearing a writer say, he always said his book's in Seattle, and he said, I know the library is not close to the post office, just deal with it. I'm sorry that I needed it to be that way. He said, we make this stuff up, don't forget. But when I was writing my series, I set it in San Jose, where I was living at the time. And I really went to a lot of pains to make sure that the streets that we were walking down were the right streets. And, you know, part of the fun is going to places and walking around and taking those notes. And, you know, that's why I set one down in outside of Monterey, so I could always go to the ocean and walk around and pretend I was doing work. But, you know, one of the biggest compliments I ever got was that a native to San Jose told me I had gotten everything right. So it was worth all the effort. And I think especially if you're setting up a series, you know, you've got to do all that kind of legwork in the beginning. In my other series, I did put in a fictitious town, but mostly because the way the policing went there, it would have been too complicated for a book. So, and it also gave me the freedom to just say and whatever I wanted to say about that town without worrying about hurting anybody's feelings. So really consider your setting, just really consider it. And like we say all the time, intentionally, do it intentionally.
Can I say something that your story about San Jose reminded me of, which is that I read a book recently and I don't remember the title. I'm saying that honestly, I wasn't that impressed with it, but it was set in Seattle where I grew up. And every page had some reference to a well-known location. It felt like the author did not live in Seattle. It felt like the author had just like Googled landmarks in Seattle, because like people who live in Seattle don't visit the Space Needle. Nobody who lives in Seattle ever goes to the Space Needle, and yet the protagonists were there for dinner. Like, no, they weren't. Only tourists do that. You know? And so anyway, it just, that kind of stuff, just be careful of that sort of thing.
Yeah. I remember reading a book by a very famous, very well-known author, and he had sent his protagonist to Las Vegas. And the guy literally opened up the magazine in the hotel and started reading out things like population and the square mileage of Vegas. And it was really off-putting. So yes, as someone who grew up in Niagara Falls, I never made it the mist until last year. So
yeah, just try to be authentic with what you're doing is what we're trying to say, I think.
I will circle back a little bit to a previous video that we did in talking about community and relating it back to this, in that I had a fellow book coach who does not live in the United States, but is setting her book in Boston, write to me and say, I just have a few questions. Could I ask you? And I bet she's sorry she did, because I sent her back probably like a 7-page email about like, here's all this stuff and here's how people and da 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 da. And like, so we'll see. Hopefully when the book comes out, it's you know, there's a couple things at least that I know she wrote back and was like, oh, I'm glad I learned that because I would have said that. And I'm like, oh yeah, Boston native would never have done that. So find your community, find a writer who lives in the city that you want to write in.
I hope they're as generous as Carrie is with the information.
If you want to know things about Boston, you know how to find me. So, but beware, because you might get a 7-page email in return. But yeah, I mean, isn't that also, just to wrap up a little bit, I mean, isn't that part of like why we all love to read too? Because we love learning about different places and putting ourselves there, even though there's probably plenty of places on this planet. And of course, all the places that, you know, writers make up for fantasy and sci-fi and all other kinds of kinds of writing as well, that like, you know, we get to go inhabit those places. So, you know, when you're thinking of your readers, that's a huge reason why they want to be reading your book. And that's why it can be so important to make sure that you're connecting that way.
Yeah.
Oh, that is it for our spirited discussion about setting and place. We hope you found an answer or all kinds of information that made sense to you at this point in your life and at this point in your book. Remember that you can submit your question anytime at dearbookcoach.com. And if you subscribe to our weekly email, you will be eligible monthly to win a call with a coach. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.